Dr. Phil said, I am an artist, I am an author, I am a community organizer, I am an entrepreneur, formerly an NFL football player, but more importantly, I'm a son of the city of Baltimore. Myself and Dr. Phil have worked together for some time now on multiple different initiatives, which is probably the reason that I'm standing before you tonight. But talking about art and activism really is my life's work. For those of you that have a couple of my books being circulated right now, my work centers on a wide array of topics, many of which are very specific to the city of Baltimore and the experience of the Black community here. But more importantly, most of the work centers on the thesis of using art as a tool for social change. For those of you in this city for those of you in this room that are from this city, you probably are well aware of the fact that we are a city of many challenges, especially in the African American community. We represent a very large sector and portion of the city, and also a large sector and portion of the disenfranchised, marginalized areas of the city, have been since its inception. Growing up here, I was no stranger to a lot of these struggles. I grew up pretty typically West Baltimore upbringing. I grew up in the West Baltimore area, Emerson Village area specifically, and I was fortunate to have two parents in my household until my mother passed away, giving birth to my sister, which sent us down a long spiral of a whole lot of different challenges and struggles that I won't bore you with today, but just say that life wasn't easy coming up. But one thing that I was blessed to have in my life at a very early age was the arts. My parents recognized that I had certain gifts very early on: drawing, painting. I say oftentimes I was the aluminum foil bandit and the Reynolds wrap thief in my household. Anything that we had in the house that could be used to make something, it got stolen at some point, and I would just disappear into some sector of the house, and I would start making myself action figures, toys. Sculpting was probably the first thing that I started playing around with, but as soon as somebody let me get my hands on pencil and some crayons and some paper, all of a sudden I found my love language. I tell many people I was creating art before I could form words and speak, and especially after my mother's passing, the arts became very central in my life for several reasons. For one, anybody that's from here that grew up in an inner city environment, you probably understand that tough love is really our love language across the city. Doesn't matter where you come from or what sector you were born into. And that has its positives and its negatives. I tend to try to look at things from an asset-based perspective, but being real, when you have a traumatic experience like losing a parent, one of the things that you first realize is there's not a lot of grace for you. In the school system, in the community, in the neighborhood, none of my homies really wanted to hear me talk about how I was up all night and I couldn't sleep because I had a dream of my mother, and now I'm just crying myself to sleep every single night, and I don't really know what I'm doing. The typical response to something like that would be toughen the hell up and get over it. But through the arts, what I found was a language to be able to express what I was feeling in a way that didn't bring ostracism or judgment, but that actually created a space for me to be celebrated in a sense. I would do painting or draw a picture or write something that other folks my age could identify with, and all of a sudden there was space for us to have uncomfortable conversations that we wouldn't have been able to have otherwise. So at a very early age, I realized that art could be a bridge between people from different walks of life and people with different lived experiences. And as I started to get older and familiarize myself much more intimately with the struggles of the community, I started realizing the efficacy of art in terms of building those bridges in community and not just in individual interactions. One of my favorite things about art, whether you talk about visual art, spoken word, music, literature, or anything else, is it allows us to be able to build connections and have conversations based off of what we feel. Art is very unique in that way. If I were to put a painting up, one of my paintings up on this wall right now, We could have a million different conversations about what you guys think the reason for me creating the piece would be, or what you think the intended message of the work may be, or what you think the inspiration behind the work may be. What we would realize is there might be a million miles between your world and mine, sister. There might be a million miles between your world and mine, brother. But what we realize quickly is the space between us, that gray matter that separates us, is actually the fun space that allows us to grow. If we're able to get uncomfortable enough to jump into it. But we're living in a society that doesn't want us to do that. What they want is for us to reside in our silos of bigotry and circumstance. What they want is for us to reside in our silos of what our lived experiences are and only build community with folks that can understand and empathize with that because of their lived experiences. But the uncomfortable stuff, that gray matter space, that space that is foreign but also beautiful, is the space that I've chose to build my whole career around living in. Through art, you can create the space to have uncomfortable conversations through a lens that actually focuses on bringing about the changes that we need. Through art, we can actually begin to express some of those feelings in a way that may be palatable for somebody else to actually bring about the space of empathy and understanding. And through art, we can actually challenge one another as well as society to do better. And as a Black man, as I started to get older, I realized the importance of that narrative in the tapestry of my history, right? Because if you look at the experience of Black people in America, our story has been narrated through what? Through the arts. If I ask a question, you can just shout out. You don't need me to call on you. At the end of the day, when you look at the time of enslavement, what's going on, good brother? How you doing? Good to see you.
Likewise.
When you look at the time of enslavement in this country, when the slaves would sing Negro spirituals to themselves in the fields, in the cotton fields, in the rice fields, in the indigo fields. When you look at the time after enslavement during the radical Reconstruction period, or even the arts and the Renaissance period, when you look at jazz, when you look at the blues, when you look at rock, the early rock and roll, when you look at the birth of hip hop, all of these art forms were built around the construction of a narrative about our community that we actually control. There's a quote by Zora Neale Hurston that I quote very often because I think that it's so powerful. She said one time, if you're silent about your pain, they'll kill you and tell the world you enjoyed it. That's been Black people's experience in this country, especially when you look at the climate now with people trying to take subjects out of schools and people demonizing the idea of subjects like critical race theory, which isn't even an elementary or a middle school or a high school course, but a college course. What's the reason for that? Because if you're going to dismantle a system, you have to first understand the system. You have to first be able to dissect the sickness within that system. And if you look at the question of how we do these things, one of the first entry points into the understanding and the dismantling of these systems is the arts. The arts provide the space for you to first begin to understand and empathize with a situation pertaining to a marginalized community, for example. When you look at the early stages of hip hop, that was what it was all about. It was all about the idea of consciousness, the idea of nation building, of community upliftment. It wasn't until it became a huge commercial success that you started to see all the toxic traits inserted into it that we're still dealing with the ramifications of today. When you look at COINTELPRO and its devil's work that it did on all of the Black leaders of pretty much every liberation struggle in the history of this country, they trafficked in disinformation, in breaking up of unified neighborhoods and organized systems that were going against some of the harmful rhetoric and some of the harmful institutions that are prevalent in our country today. They use the arts both to inspire and to demonize. They use the arts to both unify and divide. So if we understand how the arts have been utilized against us in these ways, you get a better understanding of why it's so important that we use art with intention. I'm not the type of person that creates art for art's sake. You know what I mean? Every time I sit down, whether I'm writing, whether I'm painting, whether I'm sketching, whether I am penning a poem or taking a photograph, there's an intention behind the inspiration where I ask myself, why am I doing this? What story am I trying to tell? And why is there a necessity for this story to be told? And then, am I the right person to be telling this story? Because a lot of the times, when you look at a lot of the narratives about communities like mine, those narratives don't come from within the community. It comes from outsiders that are giving their vantage point, ignorant as it may be, to what they think is going on. Oftentimes without even having deep and involved conversations with people within those communities about what it is that they want, what changes they want to see, how they wish to see these communities evolve and change for the better. One of the things that art does is it puts us in a driver's seat when talking about controlling narratives of our community. And we have the ability as artists and creatives to humanize ourselves in the eyes of people that don't know us, to tell stories of our existence that people would oftentimes never hear had it not been for us having the boldness and the courage to be able to share it. And what it also does is it creates a model for what society could look like given the proper chance and opportunity. When you talk about utilizing the arts for social change, one of the key factors in that process is being able to understand that no war is fought on one front by itself, right? If we were all at war as a class against another class, we would need our ground infantry to handle things on the ground. We would need our Navy to be able to handle things from the sea. We would need our Air Force to be able to handle things from the air. So how do we think that we can wage war politically or socially without doing it in the same organized manner, right? Sometimes we've got to understand that our role, no matter how big or small, factors into the grand scheme of things. And the role of an artist is just as important as the role of a politician, as the role of a judge or an organizer or anybody else. Many times, all of these things are symbiotically connected. Because if we're looking to transform society, you need three things. You need those that are creative enough to be able to imagine things in a different way. That's why oftentimes we call it a reimagining of society, right? You need people that are creative enough to imagine how things can be different. Then you need people that are clever enough to strategize how that change is possible. And then you need the folks that are courageous enough to go out into the world, into the trenches, and actually make it happen. But none of these three things can be accomplished without the other two. And a lot of times we prioritize one front while minimizing the role and responsibility of the other. I realized very early on what my role was supposed to be in the fight. I wear several hats, so at some point I'm the strategist, at other points I'm the reimaginer, at other points I'm in the trenches actually forging ahead, trying to make things happen. But understanding that we have to be able to compartmentalize these three roles in order to actually achieve this reimagining that oftentimes we discuss in spaces like this. So at a very young age, understanding these things, I was very fortunate to be able to meet a man that I call my second father, who is my artistic mentor, a guy by the name of Larry Pancho Brown. Anybody that's never heard the name, you should definitely look up his work. He's a titan in my opinion from the standpoint of Black artistry, because growing up, he was the first person whose work I saw on television. His artwork was all on the walls of The Cosby Show, In Living Color, so many of the Black TV shows and cinema that I grew up watching. And he was also the first Black man that I ever knew that had no boss. that answered to no one deity or person, that actually went out and lived life on his own terms, his way, telling stories about our community. And he was able to build up a large enough following around that work, as Dr. Phil spoke to earlier, where he lived life on his own terms, but he wasn't a starving artist. Still to this day, he does what he wants, he goes where he wants, and he lives the type of life that many kids would aspire to live if they actually knew that it was a possibility. But the same way, many of our communities are deprived of examples of doctors, lawyers, politicians, and so many other things. If you've never met somebody that looks like you, that lives life in this way, you don't necessarily know that that's a possibility that you have for yourself. But because of my relationship with Pancho, not only did I see an example of what that looked like, but I had somebody that could give me the blueprint about how I could actually begin to do some of these things myself. So at a very young age, when I was in middle school, I took classes at Maryland Institute College of the Arts on scholarship because of programs that I did through Pancho. I was traveling around the country with him, going to art expos and exhibitions where I was introduced to artists like Charles Bibbs and Kevin A. Williams, way too many to name, but so many people that, like Pancho, lived like their own way on their own terms and created work that people were huge consumers of, but they didn't have a boss. The only people that they were accountable to were the folks in their community that patronized their work. And I understood that if done the right way, I could actually live a similar life and existence myself. Despite the fact that I was an athlete and I had aspirations of playing in the NFL, which I eventually did, after 5 years of being in the league, I realized that my real passion wasn't on the gridiron, it wasn't on the football field, it was in community. Because every off season I would find myself not staying in the city that I played in, but coming back home to Baltimore, living in the hood. I still live in the Sandtown, Winchester community. If anybody's familiar with that area of the city, the uprising in 2015, the young man, Freddie Gray, that was killed by those police officers, it was in my neighborhood. I actually taught at the school that he attended. So when people talk about him specifically, right? They'll talk about his lengthy arrest record. They'll talk about some of the negative aspects of his childhood and his upbringing. But what they rarely talk about is how that entire community has been systematically divested in for years. What they rarely talk about is the lack of opportunity that still to this day exists there. The lack of resources, the lack of tangible work and role models that actually show these kids how to connect those dots. People like myself still to this day are fighting tooth and nail every single day, 24/7, to make sure that those things exist for the generation of kids that are growing up in that existence now. But very rarely do we talk about how these systemic issues actually breed the problems that people spend all of their time complaining about. But rather than spending time complaining, I want to figure out how to be pragmatic about creating solutions. So every single time I paint, every single time I write, every single time I construct something that is to be consumed by other people, I do so through a lens that challenges them to change the vantage point by which you look at my community and communities like mine. Change the algorithm that we use to dissect these problems and ultimately come up with solutions. And also to inspire us to give a damn enough to do something to make a change. Because half the time, that's most of the battle. Think about a piece of artwork like, who in this room is familiar with the Rosie the Riveter painting? Anybody? Okay, a few. Sis, what was that painting for anybody in the room that isn't familiar? Yeah.
It's probably empowerment.
Say it again.
Empowerment.
Yeah, it's about empowerment. Do you know the reason why it was created? Go ahead.
It was during when a lot of men were at war, women had to go to work. It was kind of like, well, we can do it too, because now they were forced to go to work. And,
Exactly.
Be moms at the same time.
Exactly. So during the World War, most of the men in the country were at war. Most of the women that were at home had to eventually join the workforce. But we live in a very patriarchal society that at that point had told women that all that they were good for were being at home and in the kitchen and raising children. So in order to start to dismantle that problematic patriarchal ideology, only in a way that served the country, ultimately, because they didn't want to empower the women too much, but they wanted to empower them just enough to see themselves as workers, as drivers of capital. So they created this painting of this white woman with a red bandana around her head and a work uniform on, flexing her muscles. And they put this, we pasted this thing on every window that they could find. They put it on every light pole. It was on commercials. It was all over the place. And along with other ideological texts that talk to women about the importance of getting out and joining the workforce, of making money so that they could not just provide for their families, but they should show their patriotism during this time of war. If our men are out fighting at war, then we need our women to keep the country going at home. We're not going to talk about the fact that as soon as the war ended, they tried to go right back to business as usual and push all of these women back into the kitchens and the households. But using art in that way was done very intentionally because the powers that be know the power of the arts. They know that something as simple as a painting, as a marketing scheme, as an ad campaign, can inspire people to completely shift their lives in a way that changes the country. If you look at the artwork of somebody named Emory Douglas, who was the artist of the Black Panther Party, anybody that has ever seen one of the Black Panther newspapers, he was the one that not just put the newspaper together, but all of the ads in the newspaper, all of the artwork in the newspaper, he created. He single-handedly changed the way a lot of black folks in America saw themselves and their community through his artwork. He single-handedly shifted the consciousness of Black America through strokes of his pen. These are the people that I aspire to be like. So ultimately, when I went to college, I majored in broadcast journalism and integrative arts. Anybody that's never heard of integrative arts before, essentially what it is it allows you to go through all of the different art curriculums and really all of the curriculum in the college specifically, and choose your own courses. But you have to write an essay, a thesis statement, so to speak, to say what it is that you're trying to learn from taking all of these courses. What's the goal of this degree for you? How are you looking to apply it in real life? Ultimately, what I wanted to do is what I'm doing now, using artwork as a tool for social change. But in order to do that, I had to educate myself on the history of art like mine. I had to educate myself on the history of how we got here as a country, so that when I chose to speak on these things from an artistic perspective, I was doing so with an informed mindset and approach. And after college, when I got drafted, the first thing I did was bought a house here in Baltimore so that every off season I could come home and get intimately involved in creating change within my community. Now, when I left school, I was young, dumb, and arrogant enough to believe that the money that I was getting ready to make was gonna allow me to change everything in Baltimore. I got drafted at 20, mind you. I wasn't even 21 yet. I was very, very young. But this idea that just by signing a check, you could change things was actually something that I really believed. It wasn't until I came back home, started my foundation, got into the school system and the community, and I realized, oh, damn, this ain't even a drop in the bucket. This isn't gonna change a damn thing if I can't actually get intimately involved on the ground. So that is what caused the mindset that I have now. The idea that in order to change things for real, you have to do so through tiers. There's a political sphere, there's a grassroots sphere, and there's an educational sphere. Those are the spheres that I work in creating change in my neighborhood. I chose to go into the school system. As a product of Baltimore City school systems, I understood what the deficiencies were, but I also understood one of the main reasons that so many kids, in spite of the fact that we don't have the resources, don't get ahead within our school system is because the folks that are educating them largely don't look like them, are disengaged from the things that are important to them, and ultimately don't have the cultural context to be able to relate to them. The material that we're being taught isn't spoken in our language. The vantage point that we're being taught this material by isn't coming from people that grew up having to live through the experiences that we lived through. So I decided I was going to go into that school system and be the kind of teacher that I needed at that age. And that set the framework for the pedagogy that I use even today. Long story less long, we got into the school system. I created a curriculum that's being taught at about 30 schools here in Baltimore City, about 65 schools nationally, but also because of a lot of the structural issues within the school system, I used my platform as a former athlete to raise hell on those issues. So when I came into my school after winter break a few years ago and the heat was off, I realized quickly that it wasn't just my school, but about 65 schools across the city that were educating kids in classrooms that were 35 degrees or below. I used my platform as a former NFL player to raise issue on that. Before you know it, you have Sports Illustrated, ESPN, all of these different platforms that covered me as an athlete talking about the inadequacies and deficiencies within Baltimore City schools. If anybody's familiar with the way things go here in Baltimore though, the powers that be definitely didn't want that. So we were able to do multiple things in the short time that I was intimately in the school system that allowed us to be able to raise some funds, allowed us to be able to make certain structural changes in the school that I taught at and so many other schools that I serviced. But long story short, they had to remove me from my position because they weren't going to have that being a reoccurring thing. Every single time something comes up, it becomes a national story, and it's because of this guy. But we were able to get away with it for long enough because the principal at the school that I taught at was a close personal friend that shared my desire to transform the school system for the better. So no matter how many times they tried to pressure him into getting rid of me, because we have site-based budgets, it was his call. So long story short, he refused to fire me time and time again, and eventually they gave him a promotion. He's no longer a principal in Baltimore City School. He's the director of principals for PG County in DC. And of course, they brought in a replacement that was only going to be there for a couple months, got me the hell up out of there, and refused to answer phone calls from reporters for a few weeks, and we can wash the hands of the situation and act like nothing ever happened. But long story short, we were able to prove in a very short time what could be done when people cared enough and were intentional enough about how we go about addressing these problems to make a change. And at that time, I was really hurt. In spite of the fact I knew I had painted a target on my back as soon as I got in the school system, I thought that all of the good that we were doing was enough to offset the negative attention that was being brought on the people that quite frankly weren't doing their jobs in the first place. But I realized that as long as you're in somebody else's house, the same as if you're playing in an away game, you have to play by the rules of that field. And ultimately somebody else is in the position to determine how effective you're allowed to be. And if you want to have your own house and your own rules, you got to build it. So that's exactly what we did. Myself and another former NFL player by the name of Torrey Smith that played for the Baltimore Ravens, we got together in 2020 and decided that we were going to open up our own rec center. Well, that's a lie. First, we thought that we were going to open our own school until we actually realized not just how much work, but how much time, funds, and energy it would take to actually get one off the ground. So in trying to be pragmatic about where we could have the greatest impact, we thought about the idea of opening up our own rec center, because at least that space we control, we own and operate. And that allowed us a space to organize, a space to have community impact, and a space to be able to sow into the youth every single day. Long story short, we opened up the Hilton Rec Center, reopened one of the rec centers in the city that had been closed for the last 15 years. Many of our rec centers kind of closed around the same time, along with the deindustrialization of the city and the divestment of a lot of our most marginalized communities. We decided we were going to go into one of those spaces and revitalize it. And in the middle of a pandemic, we opened up the Hilton Rec Center and we started serving community. Long story less long, for 3 years, we were diligent, we built, we served. On a day-to-day basis, we served about 150 kids on our campus every single day. The neighborhood that we reopened this rec center in, the year before we opened, was one of the most violent neighborhoods in our city. After we opened that rec center, over the first 2 years of us being open, that community saw close to a 32% reduction in violent crime and crime in general within that neighborhood. That's astounding, but it shows the importance of the type of service that we were providing. The idea that you can't transform community without first investing in it, without first empathizing, humanizing, and understanding the plight of the individuals in that area that you're trying to serve, and being very intentional about the services that you're providing if you're hoping to transform it for the better. So we finally gotten to the point where just this past Thanksgiving, we were greenlit to do a $25 million expansion of that project. The Ravens are getting involved, Under Armour's getting involved. We can't keep the door closed to all the benefactors that are trying to get a seat at the table now. But that doesn't happen if we don't first have the vision and the understanding of how we wanted to transform community. And we're very intentional about doing it by ourselves, with no fanfare, with no resources, with no safety net or backing behind us. But I tell many people, just like if your car were to break down on the street right now, if you start calling people, you might call your boyfriend, you might call your girlfriend, you might call a whole bunch of folks to come pick you up, you might be sitting there for a while. But I promise you, if you get out of that vehicle and start pushing, within a few minutes, somebody's going to pull over and say, how can I help? That's what we decided to do. Rather than being the folks that get online and get on our soapboxes and just start complaining about every single thing that we have a problem with, we decided that we were going to do something about it. And I'm not just going to paint a pretty picture. We can do that, but the same way in the church they used to tell us that faith without works is dead, you can have hope. But without hope, without the work that goes along with and coincides with the work, the hope is gone. The city is lost. I don't believe that any benefactors are parachuting into our communities to come and save us for us. I think that any changes that are going to happen are going to be the ones that we create. And I don't believe that any change is created to trickle down from the top. I think that anything that is sustainable has to be built from the ground. That means grassroots, like Dr. Phil and I, the work that we do with We Are Us and Be More United and so many other grassroots organizations throughout the city. I understand that in order for us to achieve the changes that we want, we have to be courageous enough, creative enough, and resourceful enough to create them ourselves. And in order to do that, we have to continue to use the arts. So I know I've been talking for a long time, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of the framework of what I do, and hopefully that helps you to start to evaluate in your own lives how you can be intentional about using your platform, no matter how big or small, to start to do the same yourselves. Thank you.